Hello again, class. We're going to be talking we're going to be doing our third lesson in our American Revolution and Revolutionary War series. So we're going to pick up where we left off. From our last lesson, as you recall, the colonists, at least the Second Continental Congress, had just written the Declaration of Independence. They had agreed upon it. Franklin possibly said something along the lines of, "We must all hang together, or we shall all hang separately." All right, so is at the end of our story. The colonists get mad about taxation without representation, send some delegates to a meeting in Philadelphia, write up a piece of paper saying that they're free and the king's not their boss anymore. Is that it? Do we now have a country and everybody lives happily ever after? No, of course not. It's not that easy. Anybody can basically write down anything they want on a piece of paper. I could take out a piece of paper and say that I have now created the country of Burnetlandia, but it doesn't make it so. You have to actually get people to agree with this. And so while the colonists were going around now saying, hey, we don't have to do what the king and parliament says anymore, king and parliament still hadn't agreed to that, which is why you're going to have to fight the war, or at least that's why the colonists had to fight the war for the next 5 more years after writing the Declaration. And that was not necessarily an easy task because the quote-unquote army that they had was still largely made up of untrained volunteers in state militias. Now, the Second Continental Congress, one of the things they did once they met was create a Continental Army, all right, the National Army. Remember, they put George Washington in charge of it. But you're still recruiting people who really didn't have any experience in war. And the soldiers were only had to sign up for 1-year terms. So, by the time you get a little training, it's already time for them to leave the army. Not only that, sure, we now had the Second Continental Congress. This is something similar to a national government. I mean, in some respects, it acts like a national government, but it is very, very weak. All of the power is still with the states. The Second Continental Congress, for the most part, is going to operate under a type of constitution called the Articles of Confederation. We're going to deal with that in later lessons when we talk about the Constitution. But for now, just understand that the Second Continental Congress really didn't have any power. Most importantly, they didn't have any power to tax the colonies. So they couldn't buy things such as food and guns and ammunition, bullets and blankets and shoes and, those things that people need to fight a war. The Continental Congress really couldn't pay for any of that stuff. They could ask the states to contribute, but more often than not, the states' response was, well, we're already paying for our own militia. We really don't have a lot of money to send for your new Continental Army. So it's true, we had something of a national government, but it had very little power. We had a Continental Army, but it was extremely underfunded, undersupplied. It was very weak. So, and by the way, on these first few slides, you'll see I'm saying summarize very quickly. You don't have to write down every word I have on these slides. Just kind of hit the highlights for your notes to study. All right, so getting back to the lesson. So Washington, he wasn't a fool. He understood that he had some state militias and some untrained soldiers who didn't have any military experience, by and large. And he was fighting not only the Redcoats, who of course were a professional army. All those Redcoats, they pretty much had been soldiers their entire adult lives. They'd been training and fighting for their whole lives. Same thing with the Hessians, the mercenary Hessians. This was a professional army. That's all they did was fight and train for pretty much their entire lives. So Washington understood that he was in an extreme disadvantage. Right? So his goal was really just to keep his army together long enough until they were good enough to actually fight the British in a major battle. Right? And so Washington really throughout the duration of the war, Washington probably spends more time writing letters to Congress and to the state governments, begging and pleading for supplies, for money, for uniforms, guns, etc. Then he does actually fighting battles. Most of his time was spent probably more on logistics, trying to keep the army supplied rather than planning battles, because he just didn't have the support from a truly fully functioning government yet. Because of this, by December 1776, he had retreated into from New York and New Jersey into Pennsylvania. So, there's this initial happiness in July. Hey, we passed the Declaration of Independence. We're fighting for our freedom now. That gets people excited. Now, again, probably 20% of the people in the country were loyalists. You probably had even more than that were simply neutral. They were just trying to go to their jobs or, work their farms and didn't really care about the politics going on or this war going on. So you never really had 100% support for this war, nowhere close to it. But for the people who did support it, you did have this initial excitement that, okay, we declared our freedom, we now know what we're fighting for. But by the end of that year, the Continental Army hadn't been exactly racking up a lot of victories. The Redcoats were in charge of Boston. They'd overtaken Boston. They were in control of Boston. I believe by the end of 76, they were also in charge of New York. They had captured New York. Fast forwarding to 1777, they're going to capture Philadelphia as well. All right, so then in the early years of this war, basically all that had been happening was the Redcoats had been capturing important American cities. So Washington understood that he needed a victory, because these soldiers serving these one-year terms, most of the terms ran from January 1st to December 31st. So these soldiers were set to go home basically in December 31st of 1776. So Washington realized he needed something good to happen, to raise morale, to convince people that it was still worth being part of this army. He needed a victory to encourage his soldiers. All right, so if you look on this painting right here, most of you have probably seen this painting somewhere before, a picture of this painting. It's a very famous painting in American history. It was actually done by a German in, I believe, 1850s, somewhere around there. But it's a very famous painting, and this is Washington crossing the Delaware River. All right, so I just said Washington had retreated into Pennsylvania, basically hiding out in the woods, trying to stay away from major battles with the Redcoats. The border between Pennsylvania and New Jersey is the Delaware River. All right, so you have a river running right between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So what Washington does is on Christmas Day, 1776, he loads up his army on a bunch of boats, and they cross the Delaware River late at night into New Jersey. Then they march for several hours and surprise the Hessian army, which was in a place called Trenton, New Jersey. Surprise the Hessian army, who may or may not have still been sleeping the day after Christmas. There are legends and rumors handed down. I've seen contradictory accounts, but perhaps the Hessians had a really good time on Christmas Day. And perhaps they were sleeping in a little later than normal on December 26th. And maybe they weren't feeling their best on December 26th. There are differing accounts to this. We do know that the leader of the Hessian army here had been warned that Washington was planning an attack, but for negligence or arrogance or for whatever reason, he really didn't take it that seriously. He didn't think there was any way that his army could lose to the Continental Army, so he didn't really take extra precautions to defend against an attack. So for whatever reason, on the day after the Christmas, the Hessians didn't do their best fighting, and Washington and his army killed more than 900 of them. They end up winning another battle in New Jersey a few days later. So Washington has this big victory. Now, why is this important? Because again, the war is not going to end until 1781. It wasn't like Washington won in Trenton and the Hessians and Redcoats said, okay, you've beaten us, we give up, we go home now. No, that didn't happen. So why is it important? Well, Britain starts to realize Washington may be a better general than they thought. He may put up a little better fight than they thought. Ultimately, of course, whether Britain overestimated him or underestimated him, it's not too important. The results are really what matters. But towards those results, this Battle of Trenton and these victories at the end of the year in 1776, it lifted the spirits of the Americans, the patriots. They realized, hey, okay, Washington won. We just won some battles. Maybe it's not hopeless to join the army after all. Maybe it's not hopeless to stay in this army. All right, so a lot of those soldiers whose 1-year terms were set to end, they signed up for another year. Other Americans started to join the army. So these battles, it was as much as military significance, it was public relations. It was a PR victory. It helped boost morale. Okay, now from a military standpoint, we're going to talk about the Battle of Saratoga. Okay, and this is important. Okay, this is a very important battle. You have to understand the importance of Saratoga. Now, so this on these notes, on these slides, you probably should write down most of what I have typed up. Again, you don't have to write it word for word. You can abbreviate however you want to do it, but you need to get the information down one way or the other. And certainly, information I'm telling you, if you want to add that to your notes, that's useful as well. But know the Battle of Saratoga. Okay? You've got to know the significance of this. All right. Now, the British strategy was to capture the Hudson River. So if you look over on this map I have on the right, as you can see, those red arrows moving from the north to the south, they start from that place called St. John's. That's up in Canada. So the Hudson River basically runs straight down and parallel to the eastern border of New York State. It kind of runs through New York City and then out to the ocean. Okay, and then everything to the east and north is basically New England. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, those states. So the British thought, look, if we can get control of this Hudson River, all right, this river that basically separates the New England colonies from the middle colonies, then we can cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. Okay, and remember, this is still early, 1776, 1777. Most of the events that led to the Revolution, Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, Lexington Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill, all those early things had been in New England. Okay, so there was still an idea of, look, let's kind of divide the country into two parts. You have New England, and then you have the middle and southern colonies. Okay, that was England's or Britain's strategy. Let's kind of divide and conquer. All right, so they wanted to capture the whole Hudson River. But ultimately, they have a battle. It's really more of a siege. All right, a siege is when one army surrounds basically a city or an area and kind of basically starves out the other army. They won't let them get in and out. Sometimes during these sieges, they're bombarding them with cannon fire and that sort of things. So again, as I mentioned, certain lessons, we really don't have the time in this course to go into a lot of battle strategies and tactics. Certainly, if you're interested in that, you can definitely find things online. You can search. I'm sure there are plenty of videos on YouTube or other source or other websites, articles that can tell you more about the battles of the Revolutionary War if you're interested in that. But unfortunately, we don't have time to go too much into the military tactics. I will briefly mention them here. Britain's plan was, this General Burgoyne was going to march down from Canada with his army. So he's going to be marching south. Another British general called St. Ledger, I'm not sure exactly how soft or hard that G is. He was going to be marching over from western New York. And then a third British general, General Howe, was going to be coming up from basically the New York area or the southern area. And they were going to attack the Hudson River Valley basically from three sides and take it over. But for reasons we really won't get into, St. Ledger never makes it. He has a couple of skirmishes on his way, and he thinks it's too dangerous, so he basically goes back to Lake Ontario. General Howe basically sort of abandons the plan. He figures, well, let me go capture the capital of Philadelphia. Let me chase Washington around, because if I can capture the capital and I capture Washington's army, maybe I can put an end to the war quickly. So Howe really doesn't follow up on kind of this overall global strategy. So that leaves Burgoyne by himself. He ends up getting trapped in Saratoga, and the Continental Army, now this portion of the army was led by Generals Horatio Gates and General Benedict Arnold, meet in Saratoga, and they win the battle. After a siege and then a battle, General Burgoyne surrenders in October of 1777, and the Continental Army captures 6,000 British troops and all of their weapons. So remember, the Continental Congress is having a very difficult time providing the Continental Army with weapons and supplies. So capturing the enemy supplies is a very big victory for Saratoga. Okay? So the reason I tell you you have to know and remember about the Battle of Saratoga. Looking back on it, we view it as the turning point of the Revolutionary War. We think, okay, without Saratoga and the events that happened after Saratoga, the war might have come out very, very differently. Because, again, not necessarily, I mean, partly from a military standpoint, okay, if the British had been able to separate New England and the rest of the colonies, that would have made it very, very difficult for the 13 colonies to continue to fight in a unified manner. So from a military tactics standpoint, keeping the British from taking the Hudson River Valley was an important point. But as much as the military importance the battle caused, it was the political importance of the things that happened after the battle that really makes it the turning point. Okay, so what's so significant about it? Well, after Saratoga, after the Continental Army had this large victory over the British Army, and this one wasn't sort of a sneak attack, the day after Christmas like in Trenton. This was more what they call a pitched battle, and just army versus army. Everybody knows what the other one's doing, and the Americans win. And this caused countries in Europe to realize, hey, you know what? The Americans might be able to win this war. This might just not be some exercise in futility over in America. They may have a chance. Okay? And this is important because after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, and after we voted for independence, Benjamin Franklin hops on a ship and goes over to France in 1776 and asks France to help fight the British. So, by the October of 77, when the Battle of Saratoga took place, Benjamin Franklin had been in France for about a year, trying to convince them to help. And secretly, France was doing a little help. They were, trying to provide a little arms and money, but they were doing so secretly. Okay. Now let's review. What have we learned so far about this time period? Remember, 1754 to 1763. What was going on? The French and Indian War. Okay. Britain and France had just fought a war. Now, granted, they had fought it over on multiple continents, but in part, it started in the Ohio River Valley. And the result was France lost its North American empire, or holdings. All right, they lost all the land they had in North America. So, France wasn't opposed to getting a little revenge on Britain. All right, France is sitting there thinking, hey, okay, Britain took away our land in North America. They took away Canada. They took away the land we had both east and west of the Mississippi River. Now, the eastern part went to Britain. The western part was given to Spain for reasons we don't need to go into here. But the end result of the French and Indian War was all of that land that had been controlled by France for so long was now controlled by other countries. So, France thinking, hey, if we lost our land in North America, wouldn't it be kind of funny if Britain loses 13 colonies too? Now, Britain would still have Canada, but they'd have lost a big portion of their North American colonies. All right, so France is motivated just because they're in this forever endless struggle with Britain as to who's the dominant power in Europe. Okay, they had been fighting each other off and on for 200 years probably. They were going to continue fighting each other. They would have a war against each other in the 1790s again. They would basically be at war from about 1803 to 1815 in what we call the Napoleonic Wars. Maybe you'll learn about those more in your world history class later. All right, so France and England they didn't really need much of an excuse to fight each other. All right, so when America's over there asking France for help, France is intrigued, like, hey, chance to get back at the British. But they don't want to be very public about it initially if they think the Americans are just going to, lose this war within a year or two. And so if they're public and they end up supporting the losing side, then they're afraid Britain's going to try to come back after France in Europe. So they don't want to be public about it at first. But after the Saratoga victory, the French king decided, okay, maybe this isn't a lost cause. So he recognizes U.S. independence, and France and the U.S. officially form an alliance, which is another name for a partnership. And then France declares war on Great Britain. So now, instead of having just the Continental Army and their, untrained soldiers, inexperienced soldiers, state militias of basically temporary soldiers, now you have France. All right, France, whose army is as powerful as Britain's. Now, France doesn't have as strong of a navy, but their army is probably on equal footing with Britain's. All right, so now it's a little more of a fair fight. So France starts sending money, equipment, and troops to the American patriots. On a smaller scale, the same thing happens with Spain. All right, France says, hey, Spain, remember that island over there called Britain that we hate so much? We think we're going to fight them. You want to help us? And Spain says, yeah, why not? Because Spain's thinking, look, we own all this land west of the Mississippi River. All right, they own what is now Mexico. They own Central America. They own about half of South America. All right, Spain has a huge, huge colony in North and South America, and particularly North America. All right, they own basically everything from the Mississippi River to California and Oregon. Okay? So from Spain's point of view, who would you rather have on the other side of the Mississippi River? The British Empire or these 13 little colonies who haven't, up until now, even been allowed to cross the Appalachian Mountains? Right? You'd rather have the 13 colonies because Spain figures, okay, well, we can kind of push them around and bully them around, and there's really not much danger in us losing the Mississippi River to these 13 colonies. All right? Now, if you fast forward 20 or 30 years, it probably wasn't real brilliant thinking on Spain's part, but that was their thinking in the 1770s. So in 1779, Spain declares war on Britain. Now, Spain doesn't give nearly as much help as the French do, but they do give a little help. For instance, the Spanish governor of Louisiana, and remember, the Mississippi River runs right through Louisiana, right down through the current city of New Orleans. So if you control New Orleans, you control the Mississippi River. Remember, you control all of trade in the middle portion of North America, all of the trade and travel. All right, so the Spanish governor of Louisiana, he captures British troops in cities called Natchez and Baton Rouge. All right, that's in Louisiana. So he does help keep the British from taking control of the Mississippi River. So Spain also helps. Not as much as France does, and they don't get nearly the credit that France does, but Spain does in fact help. All right, on a more personal level, the Marquis de Lafayette. And by the way, he has about 12 names, and that's maybe only a slight exaggeration. We're just going to call him the Marquis de Lafayette. But he's this 19-year-old French nobleman. His parents have died, but he inherits all their money. And so he shows up. He's looking for glory. He shows up to help Washington. He volunteers to serve for no pay. and more importantly, he brings about $200,000 to help the Americans buy clothes and supplies. So he takes some of his inheritance and gives it to the Americans. And he's also, helping convince the French king to send troops to America. So he almost immediately gains Washington's respect and confidence, and he gains command of an army division. So for any of you who've seen the musical Hamilton, Lafayette's in there. He's basically about the same age of Hamilton, and so Washington ends up with these three guys on his staff: Lafayette, Alexander Hamilton, and a guy named Henry Lawrence, and they're all about the same age, 20, 21. They're all college age, and they sort of become almost like a family, almost like Washington's sons. Washington didn't have any kids of his own. Now his wife Martha had kids from a previous marriage, so Washington has some stepkids, but he never had kids of his own. And these three sort of become almost like son-like figures to him, and he gives them a lot of responsibility. And Lafayette uses his responsibility and his influence in France, to really help out the American army going forward. All right. You can think about this when you don't necessarily have to write the things down. Benedict Arnold, let's mention him. Very famous name in American history. He was one of the heroes of Saratoga. He may have been the main hero of Saratoga. But he's wounded. And while he's recovering from wounds, he marries a loyalist. Remember, loyalists are people who are loyal to Britain. So he marries a loyalist. And while he's married or recovering from his wounds, he starts becoming bitter. He doesn't think he received enough credit for his role at Saratoga and other battles. And he's probably partially true or correct in this matter. He and Horatio Gates didn't really get along, but Horatio Gates was in the higher position. And so when Horatio Gates writes his official reports about what happened at the Battle of Saratoga, he kind of leaves out Benedict Arnold's important role and isn't really giving him the credit that Arnold probably did actually deserve. But Benedict Arnold becomes very bitter about this, and he eventually commits treason. He ends up in some scheme trying to help Britain capture the fort of West Point. It ultimately fails because it's found out, and so he has to escape to the British. But even to this day, Benedict Arnold means traitor. If someone in America calls someone a Benedict Arnold, they're meaning they're a traitor. They're not being loyal. Okay, let's talk about one other very famous event, also kind of a turning point here. Now, if someone asks you what battle is the turning point of the war, mention Saratoga. But we need to keep track this winter at Valley Forge. So while Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold were up in the north in winning victories at Saratoga, Washington's army was still stuck in Pennsylvania, okay, without supplies and food, and they end up having to spend what turns out to be a very, very harsh winter in a place called Valley Forge in southeast Pennsylvania. Okay, it's a little bit of ways outside of Pennsylvania. Okay, and so by this time, Pennsylvania had been the capital of the 13 colonies, but the government had to flee when the Redcoats showed up, and the Redcoats have control of what was the American capital. So Washington's army retreats to this little town called Valley Forge in southeast Pennsylvania. Now, on the march to Valley Forge, many of the soldiers had no shoes. They only had blankets to cover themselves. And there's stories about how the men are basically leaving bloody footprints as they march through the snow. You just see these bloody footprints, a trail of blood through the snow. These were horrific conditions the army's going through just to get to Valley Forge and then to spend the winter there. Okay, and about 1/4 of them died. All right, so not through battle, all right, just through the conditions and through lack of supplies, Washington loses 25% of his army over the winter of 77-78. And as usual, Congress is very slow in helping out, in sending supplies. Some private citizens sometimes helped. I remember one story, there was a group of people in Philadelphia and they show up and they get a team of oxen together and carry supplies to Valley Forge. And so Valley Forge not only uses the supplies that were sent on this team of oxen, but then they kill and butcher the oxen for meat. So it's kind of a double gift, so to speak. So there were private citizens who were trying to help out the cause and helping to keep at least some of the soldiers alive. But it was a horrible, horrible winter. But that's not why we study it. We don't study it just because it shows how bad the conditions were and what these soldiers had to endure and put up with to win the war. But there was some good that came of it. This guy named Baron von Steuben. Now he was a former member of the Prussian army. He arrived at Valley Forge and began training the soldiers, even though he really couldn't speak English. As I recall, I believe now a lot of people back then, especially from Europe, but also many of the educated Americans, spoke multiple languages. So he spoke German. He couldn't speak English, but I believe he spoke French. So he would give orders in French, and then members of Washington's staff who could speak both English and French would then translate from the French to the English to tell the soldiers what to do. So, von Steuben is able to teach the soldiers how to march and fight in proper formation and handle the weapons more efficiently. All right, so, the story is he meets Benjamin Franklin over in Europe, and von Steuben is talking about all of his military experience. It turns out he almost certainly exaggerated a lot of it, but he did have some military experience, more than probably a lot of the soldiers at Valley Forge. So even though he kind of exaggerated his own experience a little bit, he did have more than most of the men he was training. So he showed up at Valley Forge with this letter from Franklin saying, "Dear General Washington, this guy claims to know about how to train an army. Why don't you give him a try?" So Washington says, "Sure, we can't fight. Terrible winter conditions. These soldiers are starving and with nothing to do. Let's at least use this time to train them." All right. So von Steuben tells them how to march and how to stay in proper formation, handle their weapons more efficiently. All right. And this last point is an important point. Remember, they're not fighting with modern technology. They're fighting with muskets. All right. And this is the type of gun that takes a long, long time to load and reload. You basically have to, put a shell in and pour in some gunpowder, and then you have to get this metal rod to pack in the gunpowder, and then you have to light it and then pull the trigger. And this takes a long, long time. And so you can only fire one bullet at a time. So you fire your one bullet, then you have to spend all this time getting out this little sack of gunpowder and pouring it in, et cetera, et cetera. Well, all the time you have a line full of soldiers from the other army marching towards you and shooting at you. So a lot of times, the armies that were most successful in battle, a lot of it came down to who could load and reload their weapons the fastest. Because if the other army can shoot 3 times in the time it takes your army to shoot 2 times, well, they're going to be shooting, that's 50% more bullets that are being fired at you. All right, so a lot of the battles came down to simply who's more efficient at firing their weapons and handling their weapons, because they, by our standards, pretty primitive weapons, pretty primitive guns at least. All right, so von Steuben helps the Continental Army get much better at these things. All right, so the Continental Army, at the end of Valley Forge, at least the 75% of them who actually lived, the Continental Army was much better trained after their stay at Valley Forge. So this winter, from 77 to 78, you've had the Battle of Saratoga that kept the British from cutting the colonies in two. It brought Spain and France in the war, and now the Continental Army itself, because they've had time. Again, the ones who did survive Valley Forge, in the harsh conditions there, those people who survived it and didn't manage to get smallpox or dysentery or die of starvation or freezing, all these things that were killing people at Valley Forge, the ones who survived came out at the end of it as a much better army. All right, and so now what had been a very, very unequal fight. All right, you had the Prussians, this mercenary group. You had, the Redcoats, who were trained professional soldiers, against basically, a bunch of farmers and artisans who had never fought before. An unfair fight. After Saratoga and after Valley Forge, it becomes a much more fair fight. The Continental Army now has some training. You have France and even to a lesser extent Spain helping out. So it becomes a fair fight. Now in our next one, we'll cover the last few years of the war and the culminating battle in our next lesson, that is. All right, so we'll end this. Just remember, just because America won or declared their independence, they still had to win it. And winning it wasn't that easy when you had an underfunded and untrained army. But through these events, Saratoga and Valley Forge, the Army's able to gain power, gain prestige with other countries, and get in a position where ultimately, a few years later, they can win the war. And we'll talk about that in our next lesson.